We have Krzysztof Choromansky talking about structured evolution with compact architectures for scalable policy optimization.
It's a great pleasure to give this talk. Google Brain Robotics team in New York and Cambridge University. It's a joint work with Mark Rowland, Vikas Sindfani, Richard Turner, and Adrian Weller. So what is the goal of this talk? We want to present a novel way of learning optimal policies for reinforcement learning using evolution strategies. So the policy is encoded by the neural network. The input vector is the state vector. The output vector is a proposed action vector. And we think about it as a black box optimization problem, where the input parameters of the black box function, the input arguments, are the parameters of the neural network encoding the policy. And the output is the total reward obtained by an agent applying this particular policy in the given environment. If we think about it from the optimization point of view, I mean, we really want to maximize this function. The ancient way of doing this would be just sense the gradient using standard finite difference method. It's not very efficient because we need lots of perturbations to collect these outputs of the function, and this is a bottleneck of computations. What we come up here is a way of doing many perturbations at the same time, and in such a way that the direction describing perturbations are pairwise orthogonal. So this is what we call gradient sensing with randomly rotated basis. And it's somehow related to the paper that was introduced a couple of years ago when guys from OpenAI proposed to use Gaussian directions as perturbations to approximate the gradient. However, what we want to really focus on here is the orthogonality, because by assuming that the directions are pairwise orthogonal, we can actually reduce the variance of the estimator, the gradient estimator, and that's the key point to get better quality sensing. So let's just note like one thing, like these Gaussian methods are related to something that we call the Gaussian smoothing of the black box function. So we do not really optimize the function itself, but a smoothed version of this function. And if we think about it this way, then the methods, like the Gaussian methods, both our methods and OpenAI Gym methods, is basically unbiased Monte Carlo estimation of the gradient of the Gaussian smoothing of the function. And on the top of that, we can use gradient-based methods to compute optimal policies. And this is the case because the gradient of the Gaussian smoothing is given by this expectation right here in the blue box. So we can come up with Monte Carlo estimators. Standard way of doing this, the bunch of unbiased Monte Carlo estimators with different control variant terms. What we propose is to instead use pairwise orthogonal directions instead of using Gaussian unstructured. And that reduces the variance of the estimator. It's not clear like what control variance terms like, would be optimal in this setting. However, the point is that like for all these unbiased estimators, we can use orthogonality trick, and it improves the quality. So one thing that I want to mention is the orthogonal trick is not valid like only here, like in the policy learning setting, but actually it was applied successfully in kernel approximation with random feature maps, GLT, recently even recurrent neural networks. So the theoretical result that we have, it's basically a motivation for like why it works is the result saying that the mean squared error of the gradient of the Gaussian smoothing using orthogonal directions is strictly smaller than the mean squared error of the gradient of the Gaussian smoothing, of the estimator of the Gaussian smoothing using standard unstructured directions. And we know exactly what this difference is. And of course, like the intuition is that better quality estimation should lead to better quality policy if we use some gradient-based method on the top of that. And now, the problem with Gaussian orthogonal stuff is that it's not very efficient if you want to sample orthogonal directions at every iteration just because you need to do Gram-Schmidt orthogonalization. And you don't want to do it like with policies of thousands of parameters. So is it the case that we have a system that produces more accurate estimator, but actually it's not very efficient? That might be the case, but fortunately there are two tricks that we can apply to make it work. And the first trick is to use approximation of Gaussian orthogonal matrices. One way of doing is take products of random Hadamard matrices. The orthogonality is embedded in the structure of the Hadamard matrix, and the randomness is given by random diagonal matrices with +1, -1 entries. And they work like reasonably well. Actually, they outperform Gaussian orthogonal matrices on a bunch of reinforcement learning tasks. But of course, you don't need to do any orthogonalization because it's embedded in the structure of the matrix. The problem with this approach, however, is that those matrices are defined the Kronecker-based Hadamard matrices are defined just for powers of 2, rows powers of 2. So now how we can get around this, and one option is to use what we call CAMAS matrices. That stands for Katz random walk-based asymptotic random orthogonal matrices approximators, where basically the approximation of the Gaussian orthogonal matrix defining the directions of gradient sensing is given by the product of low-dimensional rotations, actually two-dimensional rotations, product of Gibbon's matrices. The nice thing about it is that it's defined for any dimensionality. We don't need to add any zero padding stuff. It's just much simpler than the Hadamard mechanism. And the name of this actually mechanism is very close to my heart because this is a short version of my fiance's name. So, and it's a much better version of the standard Hadamard approach. Now, the other trick that we can apply is to make the policy much more compact, using basically structured matrices, learned structured matrices to encode the neural network. What we did here in this paper, we used feed-forward neural networks to encode the policy with 3 toplets matrices, and that basically gives us the reduction of the number of parameters from quadratic to linear. So the number of perturbations that we need actually to make to accurately sense the gradient is actually much smaller. And those structured policies work very well in practice. They, in fact, outperform unstructured ones. So this is a bunch of experimental results, low-dimensional tasks when we compare OpenAI, orthogonal methods like with unstructured methods, and they consistently beat unstructured ones. And also the robotics tasks. So Adam optimizer with standard, gradient sensing, and then our gradient sensing with structured matrices for gradient sensing and for policy encoding. What we managed to do is compress the number of parameters of the policy, at the same time learn good quality policies. So all these videos that you see here, I basically learned with structured matrices and structured gradient sensing, and the parameter is the number of parameters of the policy that you need to learn these behaviors. So it's a much more compact version of what was done before. And at the very end, the learning curves that we get for a bunch of OpenAI Gym tasks, where we basically compared our approach with the standard one. So to sum it up, there are 2 main tricks. Structured gradient sensing to reduce the variance of the estimator of the gradient of the Gaussian smoothing, and structured policies to reduce the number of parameters, and in this way, the number of perturbations that you need to do to sense the good quality approximation of the gradient. Thank you so much.
All right, while we're taking questions, let's have the next speaker come up. So I had a question. If, since large Gaussian matrices, if you normalize them, are approximately orthogonal anyway, can you give some notion about why this is so much better than random Gaussian?
It's a very good question. Like, people ask me very often, like, if you take a Gaussian matrix which is not orthogonal, the product is, like, roughly speaking 0, right? Like, why it makes sense why it makes a difference. So the point is that the reason is that when we actually apply these matrices, it's not just, we apply it like very often. So I think it's like this cumulative effect that like we need to, the fact that we have like orthogonality, it really makes a difference. The other like way of thinking about it, like for people like with quasi-Monte Carlo background, is those matrices lead to lower discrepancy of your estimators, and this lower discrepancy basically translates to lower variance. So even though it seems that at first glance that it shouldn't make a difference, it actually does. But the benefits depend on the application, and here is actually pretty huge. Thank you for the question.
All right, let's take the speaker again.